The Best of Our Knowledge explores topics on learning, education, and research. Coming up, the Israel-Hamas war has intensified debate over free speech on college campuses. And we'll speak with an internationally known advocate for human rights in the West Bank about how the war has affected learning and the natural environment. I'm Lucas Willard, host of The Best of Our Knowledge. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. Since it began in October, the Israel-Hamas war has killed at least 20,000 Palestinians and displaced around 2 million people in Gaza. Palestinian scientist and author Mazen Kumsia is the director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History and the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University in the West Bank. Dr. Kumsia is also an internationally known advocate for human rights. The Best of Our Knowledge's Jody Cowan spoke with him about how the conflict is impacting education, the mission of the museum, and the natural environment.
We do research, we do education, we do conservation efforts, conservation on the ground of endangered species, plants and animals, in situ and ex situ conservation. We do education with children. We try to show them that they have power as children, that they can shape their own future peacefully and in a way that's resistance by growing their own foods, by fighting for their rights. This is all part of our work. We don't have a condition of post-traumatic stress disorder here. We have traumatic stress disorder since it is not finished and it continues to be. And there are studies, for example, that show that 70-80% of children have psychological damage that in the West would be treatable even with medicines.
I would imagine it's an incredible challenge to work towards protecting the future when so many people are just trying to survive the present.
That's why, I say, a child watching a butterfly, for me, that's a form of therapy because he sees a butterfly, eating from the nectar of a flower. And it's a really soothing image. When people are in nature, their psychology improves. So I think we need to do more of this kind of work, reconnecting people to nature and biology and animals and plants, and also make sure that they don't harm animals themselves. They don't use plastics. They don't use fossil fuels as much as possible. So this is important because when you develop caring, and this is my own also view about myself, when I am depressed and I'm caring for somebody who's needy or for an animal who's needy that I'm feeding an animal, then I am feeling better about myself instead of being self-focused.
One of the things that I know that you guys work on and work towards is the protected area network in Palestine. Can you explain or just kind of touch on a little bit the importance of maintaining land in Palestine and maybe the challenges to doing that and maintaining that?
Palestine is an environmental decline. It's a catastrophic situation. And colonialism, the Zionist movement, and especially the Jewish National Fund has been very destructive of the environment. For example, when they uprooted 530 Palestinian villages and towns in 1948 and turned over their lands to the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish National Fund proceeded to uproot millions and millions of trees around these villages, both domesticated trees like olives and figs and almonds, but also wild trees like oaks and hawthorn and carobs, and destroy a lot of the nature. And then in place of these bulldozed trees, they planted pine trees, a monoculture of pine trees. And this to them is supposedly natural areas now, or parks as they call them, or protected areas or whatever. But those areas ended up being devoid of biodiversity and having a lot of problems. Now, when Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, just like they did with the Negev, they designated nature reserves in the areas that have a lot of Palestinians to exclude the Palestinians. And so we did some studies on this, and we published actually papers around these areas. I have 3 papers now in press documenting in great detail about the subject of use of national parks and nature reserves as a colonial tool, but not to protect nature or to protect heritage, but to advance colonial projects. So I think this is important research. And I think, Israel needs to be challenged on this. The West Bank is being bombed. The nature reserves in the South Hebron Hills, on top of the nature reserve, they have a military training zone where they have helicopters and military tanks training in the South Hebron Hills on top of what's called the nature reserve, or at least they use the excuse of a nature reserve to exclude people. Whereas the native people clearly love their nature, they love their country, and they want to protect it. And that's what we want to do, is protect real nature areas, not the ones that Israel designates to exclude us. So we actually do protect what we can.
How accessible is the Institute today? I know you said that there's programming that is ongoing still. How much of a challenge is it for people to get to this program?
Well, we are limited now. Since October 7, people cannot come from, let's say, Hebron or Jerusalem or anywhere else to visit our museum or our botanical garden or partake of our educational programs. So we become limited to Bethlehem city and the surrounding areas and the 3 refugee camps in Bethlehem. That's in terms of accessibility to come here. But there's also an issue of accessibility to us to go to where we want to go, like those nature reserves that we think we should protect that are important. Israel attacks people going out of those ghettos, settlers are on the road. It's very, very dangerous, for our field researchers to do work. I have a project, for example, in wetlands in the Jordan Valley, but for the past 2 months, I haven't been able to get to the Jordan Valley to do this.
What does the short-term future look like for the office now?
Well, we have what's called adaptation and mitigation programs. So we try to do what we can do in terms of studying our collections that we have collected in the past, insects, for example, research that we can do here in our botanic garden, education that we can do here for the people of Bethlehem, growing our own vegetables, so food sovereignty, things like that. We have limited land, only 13 dunams or so, but 3 or 4 acres. So it's not a big land, but we can talk a lot about what we are doing, but still, compared to the people of Gaza, for example, the universities in Gaza are suffering much more. 3 of them were already bombed, many of their buildings destroyed. And there is no classes even online in Gaza because Israel cut off electricity, internet, everything to Gaza, no water, nothing. And they assassinate faculty, including the president of one university in Gaza was just killed with his family on December 2nd. He was a very well-renowned scientist, received many awards. Compared to that, we haven't reached that level. It might come here. I suspect it will come here once I finish with Gaza. it will get to that level. They've already started in refugee camps in Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarem. They're bombing the refugee camps and using heavy bulldozers to destroy the roads and the water pipelines and the infrastructure of those refugee camps. So it may get to be like Gaza here soon.
What can be done to show support, to actually give support, to alleviate any of the suffering that's currently happening?
I think the first thing is to get educated, get informed. I would recommend the website which I use called ongaza.org. That's one word, on Gaza, ongaza.org. It has a lot of information, and then disseminate a lot of this information to people, pressure the governments to call for a ceasefire, to end this genocide, to stop these massacres that are ongoing for civilians, to stop exporting weapons to Israel like white phosphorus and depleted uranium weapons that are destroying people and destroying the environment, to stop supporting Israel at the UN and preventing the UN from taking any meaningful action because the US has a veto power. So a lot of work can be done where people are. And if they want to help financially, they could support groups like the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, equivalent to the Red Cross, or the UN Relief and Work Agency, or Medical Aid for Palestine, or many of the other groups that provide aid or try to provide aid. I mean, the problem is Israel is blockading Gaza and preventing aid from coming in. There's a lot of aid that's piled up at the border and cannot get in because Israel says no.
Do you have hope that humanity and nature could live harmoniously and exist in Palestine?
Well, as somebody once said, I have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Hope for me is that I continue to work and do my best, and that's all I can do. The outcome I cannot control, of course. If genocide continues, and likely it will continue for at least a few more weeks, then that's the way it is. There has been a lot of genocides in human history, like Belgium and the Belgian genocide of the people of Congo, or the Holocaust of the Armenians, the Holocaust of Jews and Gypsies and communists by the Nazis, and many others. So I then at least say that I have done my best. I cannot control the future. So for me, I don't have the luxury of despair. I continue to work and hope for the best, hope that my efforts do help. But if they don't, they don't. I mean, if we get into a nuclear war soon, which could happen, because Israel is heavily nuclear, and we could have obliteration of the human species. As a biologist, then I'll say, okay, cockroaches will take over the earth, and I did what I could, and humans didn't listen to us, so they kept going. It's very, very dangerous, and I really, really hope people wake up in the West and realize what's going on, using their support, using their tax money, using their weapons for a geopolitical game that nobody will come out a winner. Even the Zionists will not come out a winner. They won't have a habitable planet to live in. So, but as I said, we have to keep doing what we are doing and keep going and hope for the best.
Dr. Mazen Kumsia is director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History and the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University. He spoke with the best of our knowledge's Jody Cowan from the West Bank. I'm Lucas Willard. The Israel-Hamas war has brought with it, on the other side of the globe, a rise in anti-Semitic attacks and a debate over free speech on college campuses. Many activists who are rallying in support of Palestine and an end to the war say their calls for a ceasefire are being twisted into support of the attacks in Israel carried out by Hamas in October. In December, 4 days after a contentious congressional hearing, Elizabeth McGill, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, resigned. The 5-hour hearing, which also featured the presidents of Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, centered on anti-Semitism on college campuses. McGill, like the other presidents who testified, condemned hate and anti-Semitism, but the academic answers in response to questions from Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York, a Harvard graduate who repeatedly asked the college presidents if calling for the genocide of Jews would violate campus rules, drew backlash from Republicans and Democrats alike. Covering the national debate surrounding speech on college campuses is Megan Zines, a senior reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education.
We've seen a lot of college presidents and administrators since the start of the war really struggle to figure out how to respond to this. There's been both students and faculty members that have criticized statements that they put out saying that they're sort of tepid, walking the middle line, that a lot of folks are not happy with. Some people would like to see institutions and their presidents stay completely viewpoint neutral on this. Others say there's no way that you can't speak out of something on something of this magnitude. And so there was definitely an act of balancing. Both students and faculty members, Jewish and Palestinian, have felt unsafe on campus. There's that balance between free expression and academic freedom, as you said, but also ensuring that students and faculty feel safe to learn, to go to work, to do their jobs. We've seen instructors be removed from the classroom for comments that they've made. We've seen a lot of student rallies and sit-ins. And so this is something that presidents have dealt with and will continue to deal with, I'm sure, as long as things are going on over there in the Middle East.
And certainly in the shadow of an upcoming presidential election year, and while there's been political primaries going on, there's been a lot of discussion in the political sphere about speech on college campuses. You've had in Florida, as just an example, the changes with removing certain academic programs and reshaping campuses down there from Governor Ron DeSantis, who's running for president. So where does this current debate fit in the larger national conversation?
Absolutely. There's no question that the election does ratchet up the pressures around this. And we've seen certainly a lot of politicians, both on the local and national level, get involved in this most recent anti-Semitism debate, which we can talk about more, but also broader challenges to DEI. The Chronicle has been tracking those. There have been any number of, as I said, politicians on both local and national levels looking to make hay out of this, for some to get involved in some way. And I think like college administrators, they are struggling to figure out, in some cases, where do they fit into this, and how should they get involved?
So in December, there was a congressional hearing, and there were answers given from college presidents. Afterwards, the president of UPenn actually resigned. It seemed to me that a lot of the answers that were given by the college presidents were tiptoeing that high wire act, that line that you had mentioned. What can you tell me about the tone of these answers that were given before Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, how they were actually handled by the college presidents?
So the hearing itself was actually 5 hours long, but as you said, the controversy has really boiled down to this exchange that the college presidents, so Harvard, MIT, and Penn, all had with Elise Stefanik. The presidents were essentially being asked by her about chants of intifada, which is an Arabic word that a lot of Jewish folks may interpret as a call for violence, for genocide towards Jewish people. And so what Stefanik was essentially asking was, does calling for the genocide of Jewish people violate your campus's code of conduct? Would it constitute harassment? And the president's answers were that essentially it depends on context, depends on severity and directness. And those answers were seen as legalistic, as equivocating, as really lacking empathy for the Jewish communities on their campuses by some. It seemed like to some people, why can't you condemn genocide? That seemed like a fairly straightforward answer. If you ask folks in the expression circles, though, the president's answers were actually correct. Legalistically speaking, it does depend on context. But again, the overarching sentiment was just that they were being evasive, maybe lacking compassion, and unable to give what seemed like a straight answer to the question.
And as I had mentioned, this led to Liz Miguel, the president of UPenn's, resignation, and there's since been an interim president named to replace her. But what can you tell me about McGill's answers and the pressure that she may have been facing before the congressional hearing earlier this month?
So all three presidents' answers were fairly similar. And so it wasn't that McGill said anything that was particularly more controversial than either of the other presidents. But as you said, there had been pressure on her campus culture and community at Penn had really been mounting for months surrounding the war. And that goes back to August. There was a literature festival, a Palestinian literature festival that was hosted on Penn's campus. Some of the guests at that festival had a history of making anti-Semitic comments, and donors and students and faculty were upset about that. McGill ultimately decided to let the festival proceed. She and the administration saw this as a defense of freedom of speech, of academic freedom. That, of course, didn't please everyone. Then you have October 7th, increasing donor pressure, board pressure, folks calling on McGill to resign for months, really, prior to the hearing. And then she did what seemed like she did resign suddenly in a matter of days after the hearing, along with the board chair, but it really wasn't the context of those months of pressure leading up to it.
So what do you expect moving forward? Are we going to see on a national level new speech policies on college campuses? Is this scaring college presidents at all about how they may be thrown into the limelight on the political stage?
Well, certainly we saw that the three college presidents at Harvard, Penn, MIT, you had legislators calling for their resignations. And so that example, I don't think, inspired confidence among college presidents that were not involved. But also there are very clear avenues to further pressure. So all three of those institutions, Harvard, Penn, and MIT, are now subject to a formal investigation by the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, which is the committee that held the hearing. And that committee has also said pretty directly that other institutions who come under scrutiny for anti-Semitism should expect to be subject to that same level of federal scrutiny as well. So there's definitely that more direct path to scrutiny, as well as just increased pressure from donors, from prominent alumni, as we saw at Penn in particular. I would not be surprised if other institutions face similar degrees of pressure.
So Liz McGill at Penn has resigned, but we've spoken about the pressure on the presidents of Harvard and MIT. What's in the future for those individuals?
The board at MIT actually said pretty shortly after the hearing that Sally Kornbluth, their president, had their full support. At Harvard, we saw a similar statement come in support of Claudine Gay, the president there. but that statement was slower in coming. It looked like her tenure might be in danger for a little bit longer, and there were also plagiarism allegations against her that were rolling in and sort of influencing how that was seen as well. So while both of those presidents seem to be secure in their jobs for right now, I'm sure that there's a degree of looking behind their backs at what happened to McGill, certainly for those two as well as for presidents around the nation.
Now, what about pushback from students in the face of possible new rules or guidelines regarding speech on campuses? Are we already seeing pushback from students around the country?
Absolutely. As I said, there have been protests and sit-ins by students since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. And, students, even chapters of pro-Palestinian groups have been called to disband or to stop meeting. And so there's a pretty direct implications for students, as well as I mentioned, the threat to, at least they feel, to their safety, to their ability to learn. And so if there are policies that continue to, as they say, crack down on that, students are, I imagine, not going to be happy with that in many cases.
Now, Megan, what are you going to be paying close attention to in the new year with regards to higher ed and this continuing conversation about free speech on college campuses?
I think that the conversation around free speech on college campuses has been a hot button issue as long as the Chronicle has been around, but certainly this is an especially tense moment for that. I would expect that after finals and folks going back for the holidays, when we start up the spring semester, there's going to be an increased attention to this. And certainly, I think, as you said, political pressures as the election approaches. I'm sure there will be continued movements from both students and faculty. Classroom activity is, I think, something to keep an eye on. As I said, we saw instructors be removed from the classroom for their comments. So there's that academic freedom angle to it. I think there are any number of places to look for the influence of this in the spring semester, and we'll certainly be following that at the Chronicle.
Megan Zines, a senior reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education. This has been The Best of Our Knowledge, episode 1736. The Best of Our Knowledge is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Thanks to associate producer Jody Cowan. The latest on all National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter and our flagship station's website, WAMC.org. Until next time, I'm Lucas Willard.